Hey guys! Tonight, we are taking a deep dive into one of the most psychologically fascinating and frankly, claustrophobic, periods in history, the Victorian era. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the women. And not just the big picture stuff, no. We are going into the weeds, into the psychological labyrinth of rules they had to live by. We're talking about a rulebook so dense, so specific, and so utterly bizarre, it makes the tax code look like a children's pop-up book. We're talking about the weaponization of the teacup, the tactical deployment of a fainting spell, and why accepting a gift of asparagus could be a one-way ticket to social oblivion. It's a world where a misplaced fork could cause more scandal than a modern-day political tweetstorm. But before we descend into this maelstrom of petticoats and passive aggression, if you're a fan of exploring the weird, forgotten corners of history, maybe consider subscribing to the channel. I'd love to have you as part of our little community of historical detectives. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, no pressure. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing this global community of ours come together over the shared absurdity of the past. Alright, got that out of the way. Now, for the real prep. I want you to get comfortable. I mean really comfortable. We're going to be here for a while. This isn't a quick 10-minute listicle. This is a proper historical deep soak. So dim the lights, grab a drink, maybe a tea, or let's be honest, something a little stronger, because you're going to need it. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's peel back the chintz curtains and expose the beautiful, terrifying, and utterly exhausting performance of being a Victorian woman. Alright. Let's kick things off with the absolute foundation of a respectable Victorian woman's life, the art of doing absolutely nothing, but making it look incredibly busy and important. The ideal woman of the upper and middle classes was what they called the angel in the house. This wasn't just a cute nickname, it was a full-blown ideology. She was supposed to be the moral center of the home, pious, pure, submissive, and domestic. But here's the kicker, for the truly wealthy, domestic didn't mean cooking or cleaning. Oh, heavens no. That was for the servants. For a high society lady, domestic meant being a decorative object. Her idleness was her husband's or father's greatest status symbol. It was a living, breathing billboard that screamed, I am so rich, the primary woman in my life doesn't have to lift a finger. So what on earth did they do all day? Their daily schedule was a masterpiece of structured emptiness. The morning would begin, not with a rush to get to work, but with a slow, deliberate process of becoming a public-facing person. After waking, she would have a light breakfast, often in bed, brought by a maid. Then she would receive her children for a brief, highly supervised visit, more like a royal audience than a morning cuddle. The children were raised by nannies and governesses, so the mother's role was more of a benevolent queen than a hands-on parent. After the children were dismissed, the real work began, managing the household, which sounds productive, but it was really a series of meetings. She'd meet with the housekeeper to approve menus, discuss supplies, and address any servant-related drama, which, let's be real, was probably the 19th century equivalent of a reality TV show. She wasn't scrubbing floors, she was the CEO of a small, domestic corporation where the main product was respectability. The rest of her morning might be filled with accomplishments. These were skills that had no real practical value but demonstrated her refinement. Things like playing the piano, not with passion, but with technical proficiency. Singing, sweetly, but not too loudly. Sketching landscapes or flowers. Doing intricate embroidery or needlepoint, creating beautiful things that would likely just be stored away. These weren't hobbies for fun, they were proofs of her breeding and her leisure time. It was the Victorian version of a carefully curated Instagram feed, where every post is designed to showcase a perfect, effortless life. But even this, doing nothing, was governed by 1,000 tiny rules. When she sat, she couldn't just plop down. She had to glide, sinking gracefully into a chair, keeping her back perfectly straight, ankles crossed, hands resting delicately in her lap. She never lounged. Lounging was for fallen women and French novels. She never ran, she never shouted. Her movements were meant to be a kind of slow, deliberate ballet. It must have been absolutely exhausting, like living your entire life on a film set where you're the star, the director is a judgmental society, and one wrong move could get you written out of the script. The sheer mental energy required to constantly monitor your own body, your voice, your posture, it's staggering. It was a full-time job, and the salary was social acceptance. Now, once the morning of structured nothingness was over, the real social combat began. Let's talk about the single most important tool in a Victorian woman's social arsenal, the calling card. Today, we have smartphones, social media, a dozen ways to instantly communicate. The Victorians had a small piece of cardboard. And they turned it into a system of social warfare so complex it would make a Pentagon strategist weep. The calling card was, on the surface, just a piece of cardstock with your name on it. But oh, it was so much more. It was your avatar, your friend request, your away message, and your social credit score all rolled into one. The size of the card, the font used for your name, whether it had a glossy or matte finish, it all screamed messages about your class and taste. A card that was too large was seen as vulgar, a sign of new money. Too small, and you might seem insignificant. It was a typographical minefield. The ritual of calling, or visiting, was the backbone of Victorian social life. A lady would spend her afternoons, typically between 3 and 5 p.m., in her carriage, making the rounds. You couldn't just pop over whenever. Visiting hours were rigidly defined. To visit in the morning was an act of shocking intimacy, reserved only for very close family. To visit during lunch was a social crime of the highest order. So, you'd arrive at a friend's house. You wouldn't get out of the carriage yourself. Your footman would take your calling card, and you had a different card case for different occasions, by the way, and present it to the butler or maid at the door. And here's where the game truly began. The servant would place your card on a silver tray, salver, and take it to the lady of the house. Now, she had a choice to make. If she was at home to receive visitors, you'd be invited in. But the phrase, not at home, was the ultimate social tool. It didn't mean she wasn't physically in the house. Of course she was. It was a polite, coded rejection. It meant, I'm not receiving visitors, or I'm not receiving you. It was the 19th century equivalent of seeing the 3 dots on iMessage and then having them disappear, leaving you on read. It was a brutal, silent rejection. If the lady was not at home, you would leave your card. This was the critical part. You were leaving a record of your attempt. A well-to-do household would have a large card receiver in the hall, and the number and quality of the cards on display was a public testament to their social standing. It was like having your follower count displayed in your entryway. But it gets even more complicated. The cards themselves had a secret language, communicated through the folding of their corners. If you were leaving a card in person, you might turn down the top right corner, to signify it was a personal visit. Turning down the top left corner meant the visit was one of condolence. The bottom right could be for congratulations, and the bottom left was a farewell visit, if you were leaving town. It was a system of nonverbal communication, a kind of social Morse code printed on cardstock. And God help you if you folded the wrong corner. Sending congratulations for a death in the family? You might as well just pack your bags and move to a remote colony. And it wasn't just for women. A husband and wife had their own cards. When visiting another couple, the wife would leave her own card, plus 2 of her husband's cards, one for the lady of the house, and one for the man. The sheer logistics of it are mind-boggling. You had to have a precise inventory of cards, know the exact rules for every possible social interaction, and keep track of who you owed a visit to, and who owed you one. It was a social ledger, and you had to balance the books perfectly. A first visit to a new neighbor was particularly fraught with peril. The established resident had to make the first call. If they didn't, it was a clear signal that the newcomers were not considered socially acceptable. Imagine moving into a new neighborhood and waiting, day after day, for someone, anyone, to leave a piece of cardboard at your door to validate your existence. The anxiety must have been immense. This whole system wasn't just about being polite. It was about gatekeeping. It was a way for the upper classes to maintain their exclusivity, to vet newcomers, and to enforce the social hierarchy. Your stack of calling cards was a tangible measure of your worth in society. It was a world built on paper and protocol, and a single slip-up could see you erased from the social map. So, let's say you successfully navigate the calling card gauntlet. You've been admitted into the inner sanctum, the drawing room. Now you have to talk. But what you can talk about is a conversational minefield. The first rule of Victorian conversation for a lady was, be pleasant, but not too interesting. To be too intelligent or opinionated was to be unfeminine. You were there to be a gentle, agreeable presence, a beautiful piece of furniture that could make small talk. Certain topics were completely off limits. You never, ever mentioned the body. You wouldn't say someone was pregnant, you'd say she was, in a delicate condition, or, in the family way. Legs on a piano were called limbs, to avoid any anatomical suggestions. You didn't talk about money, illness, unless it was a poetic, tragic illness like consumption, or God forbid, politics. That was men's talk. A lady's conversation was meant to be light, frothy, and completely devoid of substance. You could discuss the weather, flowers, a recent concert, or a very G-rated novel. The goal was to make the men feel clever and important. You were supposed to ask them questions about their work or their opinions, and then listen with rapt attention, even if you were bored to tears. A woman who dominated a conversation or, heaven forbid, corrected a man, was committing a serious social faux pas. She would be labeled a bluestocking, a derogatory term for an intellectual woman, seen as intimidating and unmarriageable. Even compliments were tricky. You couldn't just say, "You look beautiful tonight." That was considered too direct, too personal. You had to be more oblique. You might say, "That color is most becoming on you," or, "What a charming gown." It was all about complimenting the accessories, not the person. Direct praise was seen as vulgar and overly familiar. And you had to be careful not to be too enthusiastic. Gushing was unladylike. A gentle smile, a slight inclination of the head, that was the appropriate response to a piece of good news. Loud laughter was an absolute horror. A woman was supposed to tinkle, to chuckle delicately behind her hand. A full-throated, joyous laugh was the mark of a common barmaid, not a lady. This created a culture of incredible passive aggression. Since you couldn't express strong opinions or feelings directly, everything was communicated through subtext, through what wasn't said. A slight change in tone, a raised eyebrow, a moment of pointed silence, these were the weapons of polite society. A Victorian drawing room, for all its floral wallpaper and delicate teacups, was a battlefield of unspoken resentments and social maneuvering. It was like an episode of a reality show where everyone has to communicate solely through cryptic emojis. The mental gymnastics required to decode every interaction must have been absolutely draining. Now, if casual conversation was a minefield, then courting was a full-blown military campaign, planned with the strategic precision of the Normandy invasion. The entire purpose of a young woman's life, from her education in accomplishments to her public appearances, was geared towards one single goal, securing a suitable husband. And suitable didn't mean handsome, or funny, or kind. It meant a man with the right amount of money, the right family name, and the right social standing. Love was a bonus, but it was certainly not a prerequisite. A young, unmarried woman was never, ever to be left alone with a man who wasn't a close family member. Ever. The chaperone was a permanent fixture. This could be her mother, a married older sister, an aunt, or a hired companion. The chaperone was a human security camera, a walking, talking barrier against any hint of impropriety. She would sit in the room during a suitor's visit, her knitting needles clicking like a tiny, judgmental metronome. She would accompany the young couple on walks, always maintaining a strategic distance, close enough to hear everything, but far enough to pretend not to be listening too closely. So how, in this environment of constant surveillance, was any kind of intimacy or genuine connection supposed to develop? The answer is, it mostly didn't. Instead, they developed elaborate, secret languages. This is where things get really fascinating. They used objects to say the things they weren't allowed to speak aloud. Let's start with the fan. A lady's fan wasn't just for keeping cool. It was a signaling device, a semaphore of seduction. There were entire books published on the language of the fan. A woman could have a full conversation with a potential suitor from across a crowded ballroom without saying a word. For example, holding the fan with her right hand in front of her face meant, "Follow me." Carrying it open in her left hand meant, "Come and talk to me." Placing it on her left ear meant, "I wish to get rid of you." Twirling it in her left hand meant, "We are being watched." And the most daring move? Dropping the fan. This was a direct invitation for the man to retrieve it, giving them a brief, sanctioned moment of interaction. It was the Victorian equivalent of sliding into someone's DMs, but with more lace and carved ivory. Then there was floriography, the language of flowers. This was a full-blown craze. Different flowers and even the way they were arranged carried specific meanings. A man would send a woman a bouquet, and it was essentially a coded message, a floral text. A red rose, of course, meant, "I love you." But a yellow rose meant jealousy. A sprig of lavender meant devotion. Aconite, or wolfsbane, was a warning of danger. A woman could reply with a single flower worn in her hair or on her dress. If she was given a bouquet and held it to her heart, it meant she accepted the sentiment. If she held it pointing downwards, it was a rejection. Can you imagine the pressure? Trying to assemble a bouquet that says, "I find you moderately attractive and would like to proceed to the next stage of our financially motivated courtship, but let's not get ahead of ourselves." It's a botanical and emotional tightrope walk. Even gloves had their own set of rules. A lady never went out in public without gloves. To be seen bare-handed was considered almost indecent. Gloves had to be immaculate. A single spot or stain was a sign of slovenliness. And you had to know when to take them off. You would remove your gloves to eat, of course, but you couldn't just yank them off and toss them on the table. You had to unbutton them delicately, peel them back, and place them neatly in your lap. A woman could also use her gloves to flirt. Dropping a glove, like dropping a fan, was a classic move. It was an excuse for a man to approach her. The actual process of courtship was incredibly slow and formal. A man would first have to be formally introduced. You couldn't just walk up to a woman and say hello. That was unthinkable. After a proper introduction, he might be permitted to call on her, under the watchful eye of her chaperone. If his intentions were serious, he would eventually have to ask her father for permission to pay his addresses to her. This was the formal beginning of the courtship. He would then be allowed to visit more frequently, perhaps take her for a drive in his carriage, with a chaperone in the back seat of a course, or escort her to a concert. There was no physical contact. Not even holding hands. A man might be permitted to take a woman's elbow to help her down some stairs, but that was the absolute limit. The first time a couple might have a moment of true privacy was after they were engaged. And even then, it was limited. The proposal itself was a dramatic affair. The man would be expected to declare his love in the most flowery, poetic language possible, often while on one knee. It was a performance. Everything was a performance. This entire system was designed to protect a woman's purity, which was her most valuable asset on the marriage market. A single rumor, a single moment of unguarded behavior, could ruin her reputation and make her unmarriageable. The pressure on these young women was astronomical. They were walking a tightrope their entire lives, where one false step meant social death. It's no wonder that so many of them were described as being frail, nervous, and prone to fainting. Their entire existence was a state of high alert. Okay, let's say our Victorian heroine has successfully navigated the courting labyrinth and is now engaged. The next great social trial awaits her, the dinner party. A Victorian dinner party wasn't just a meal. It was a social spectacle, an arena where status was displayed, hierarchies were reinforced, and reputations could be made or broken over the proper use of a fish fork. The planning alone was a monumental task for the hostess. The guest list was critical. You had to invite people of similar social standing. To invite someone of a much lower rank was to insult your other guests. To invite people who famously disliked each other was a recipe for disaster. The number of guests was also important. An ideal number was between 8 and 12. And you had to ensure you had an equal number of men and women. Then came the seating chart, or the plan of precedence. This was a nightmare of social calculation. The host and hostess sat at opposite ends of the table. The most important male guest was seated to the right of the hostess, and the most important female guest was seated to the right of the host. But how do you determine who is most important? It was a complex algorithm based on rank, title, age, and social standing. Getting this wrong was a grave insult. A duke outranked a marquis, a married woman outranked a single one. It was a human Sudoku puzzle of snobbery. When the guests arrived, the men would gather on one side of the drawing room, the women on the other. It was only when dinner was announced that the host would pair off the guests. He would offer his arm to the most important lady and lead the way into the dining room. The other men would then offer their arms to their designated partners. The hostess was always the last to enter the room, on the arm of the most important male guest. Once seated, you were faced with the table itself, which looked like a surgical theater. A bewildering array of forks, knives, and spoons flanked the plate. There was a specific utensil for everything: a soup spoon, a fish knife and fork, a meat knife and fork, a salad fork, a dessert spoon and fork, a fruit knife and fork. The rule was to start from the outside and work your way in. But if you didn't know that, you were in for a world of silent judgment. Using your fish fork for the meat course was the kind of blunder people would whisper about for weeks. The meal itself was a marathon, often lasting for hours and consisting of 8, 10, or even more courses. Soup, fish, an entree, a roast, a game course, vegetables, dessert, ice cream, fruit, and savories. And you were only supposed to take a small portion of each. To appear too hungry was considered common. Conversation during dinner was, like all Victorian conversation, a delicate dance. You were expected to speak to the person on your right for the first half of the dinner, and then, at a subtle signal from the hostess, often just a slight turn of her head, you would switch and speak to the person on your left for the second half. This was called turning the table. It ensured that no one was left out, but it also meant you had to abruptly cut off one conversation and start a completely new one on cue. And what did you talk about? The same light, inoffensive topics as always. But there were specific dinner table rules. You never, ever used your knife to put food in your mouth. That was for cutting only. Bread was not to be cut with a knife, but broken into small pieces with your hands. When eating asparagus, you were supposed to use your fingers, but only if it was served without a sauce. If there was a sauce, you had to use a fork. The rules were endless and often contradictory. And you had to do all of this while wearing a corset that was probably squeezing your internal organs into new and interesting shapes, making digestion a heroic feat. At the end of the meal, after the dessert and fruit, the hostess would make eye contact with the most senior lady present, give a slight nod, and then all the women would rise in unison and withdraw from the dining room, leaving the men to their port, cigars, and manly conversation, which usually involved politics, business, and off-color jokes they couldn't tell in front of the ladies. The women would retreat to the drawing room for coffee, tea, and more polite, circular conversation until the men decided to rejoin them. This physical separation of the sexes reinforced the idea that men and women inhabited completely different spheres, with different interests and intellectual capacities. The entire event was a test. A test of your knowledge, your manners, your self-control. For the hostess, it was a test of her management skills and her family's wealth. For the guests, it was a test of their breeding. The Victorian dinner party was less about food and more about a ritualized performance of class. It sounds utterly, soul-crushingly stressful. Now, we can't talk about the performance of Victorian womanhood without addressing the costume. And the centerpiece of that costume, the very symbol of the era's restrictive nature, was the corset. The corset wasn't just underwear, it was an architectural structure, a piece of social engineering worn against the skin. From a young age, girls were laced into corsets to mold their bodies into the fashionable silhouette. By the time a woman was an adult, her body had often been permanently altered by decades of tight lacing. The ideal female form was an extreme hourglass, a tiny, wasp-like waist, a full bust, and wide hips. This was a completely unnatural shape, and the only way to achieve it was through the relentless pressure of a corset reinforced with steel or whalebone stays. A woman would be laced in every morning by her mother or a maid, pulling the laces at the back as tight as she could bear. The goal was to shrink the waist down to an impossibly small size. Waists of 16 or 18 inches were considered highly desirable. For reference, the average woman's waist today is more than double that. What did this do to a woman's body? It was an orthopedic and physiological nightmare. The corset displaced internal organs, pushing the liver, stomach, and intestines downwards. It restricted breathing, as the diaphragm couldn't expand properly, leading to shallow, rapid breaths. This lack of oxygen is one of the key reasons why women were so prone to fainting. They were literally half suffocating all day long. It weakened back muscles, because the corset was doing all the work of supporting the torso, leading to a state of dependency where a woman felt physically unable to stand up straight without it. It could even crack or deform the ribs over time. But why? Why would an entire society conspire to put women through this daily, low-grade torture? It wasn't just about fashion. The corset was a powerful symbol. It was a physical manifestation of female restraint and self-control. A tightly laced woman was seen as morally upright, disciplined, and respectable. A woman with a loose figure was seen as having loose morals. It also made women physically weaker and more dependent. You couldn't run, you couldn't bend over easily, you couldn't do any kind of strenuous work while wearing a corset. It effectively turned upper-class women into delicate ornaments, incapable of doing much besides sitting, standing, and looking pretty. It was a tool of control, disguised as fashion. And the corset was just the foundation. On top of that came layers upon layers of clothing. A chemise, drawers, a corset cover, multiple petticoats to give the skirt volume, and then the dress itself. The sheer weight of all this fabric was immense, sometimes up to 15 or 20 pounds. And in the mid-19th century, it got even more extreme with the invention of the crinoline. The crinoline was a rigid, cage-like structure worn under the skirt to expand it to an enormous width. It was like wearing a personal tent made of steel hoops. While it was actually lighter and less cumbersome than wearing a dozen heavy petticoats, it created its own set of problems. A woman in a crinoline took up a huge amount of space. Walking through a doorway became a complex sideways maneuver. Sitting on a sofa meant your cage might spring up in the front, revealing your ankles, which was a scandal. A sudden gust of wind could turn your skirt into a parachute. And they were incredibly dangerous. There are thousands of documented cases of women dying because their crinolines caught fire. They'd stand too close to a fireplace, the hem of their massive skirt would catch a spark, and the cage structure would act like a chimney, funneling the flames upwards, engulfing them in seconds. They were also a hazard in factories and near machinery. It was a fashion that was literally killing women. Dressing and undressing was a lengthy process that required assistance. The fabrics were heavy, the fastenings were complex. It wasn't just clothing, it was armor. It was a costume that defined and restricted the person inside it. The very act of getting dressed in the morning was a reminder to a woman of her role, to be beautiful, constrained, and utterly impractical. So, you're dressed in your 20 pounds of fabric and your internal organ rearranging corset. How do you even move around in the world? Existing in public as a Victorian lady was yet another performance with its own set of arcane rules. A respectable woman never, ever went out alone. She would be accompanied by a family member, a maid, or at the very least, a small dog to act as a kind of token protector. To be seen walking alone marked you as either lower class or a fallen woman. The way you walked was important. You were to walk with a slow, gliding motion, your head held high, your eyes demurely cast down or looking straight ahead. You were not supposed to gawk at shop windows or turn your head to look at passers-by. You were to be an object of beauty passing through the world, not an active participant in it. The rules of acknowledging people on the street were particularly complex. You could not simply smile and wave at everyone you knew. A lady was never to acknowledge a gentleman first. She had to wait for him to bow to her. Only then could she respond with a slight, graceful inclination of her head. To smile or acknowledge a man who had not been formally introduced to you was social suicide. It implied a forwardness and lack of propriety that could ruin your reputation. But what if you saw someone you knew, but didn't want to talk to? Or someone of a lower social standing who presumed to be familiar with you? You would employ the cut direct. This was the ultimate social snub. It involved looking directly at the person and then turning away, your face a mask of blank non-recognition. You pretended they were invisible. It was a brutal, public shaming, and it was a powerful weapon in the hands of a high society woman. Shopping was another public ritual. A lady wouldn't just browse. She would arrive at a respectable establishment, be seated by the shopkeeper, and then items would be brought to her for her inspection. Haggling was out of the question. To question a price was to suggest you couldn't afford it, which was deeply embarrassing. The whole transaction was conducted with a kind of hushed reverence. Even going to church, the one place a woman was actively encouraged to go, was a performance. Your church attendance was a public display of your piety and your status. What you wore to church, which pew you sat in, which was often rented by the family, and how devoutly you appeared to pray were all subject to scrutiny. The public sphere was, for men, a place of business, politics, and freedom. For women, it was just a larger, more dangerous stage than their own drawing room. It was a place where their every move, every glance, every article of clothing was being judged. The constant pressure to be on, to perform respectability at all times, must have been suffocating. There was no real off switch. Your identity as a lady was a 24/7 job. Nowhere was this performance more intense, more morbidly fascinating, than in the ritual surrounding death and mourning. The Victorians were obsessed with death. With high infant mortality rates and diseases we can now easily cure, death was a much more present and frequent part of life. And they responded to it by creating the most elaborate, rigid, and frankly, theatrical set of mourning etiquette the Western world has ever seen. When a person died, the entire household went into a performance of grief. The first thing that happened was the stopping of all the clocks in the house at the time of death. Mirrors were covered with black cloth, because of a superstition that the soul of the deceased could get trapped in the glass. The body would be laid out in the home, often in the drawing room, for a period of viewing before the funeral. For a woman, the death of a husband plunged her into a strict, multi-stage period of mourning that could last for years. The first stage was deep mourning, or full mourning, which lasted for a year and a day. During this time, the widow's life came to a complete standstill. She was not to attend any social events, no parties, no concerts, no dinners. She was in total social seclusion. Her clothing was the most visible sign of her grief. She had to wear all black, from head to toe. But not just any black. The fabric had to be a dull, non-reflective material called crepe. Crepe was a stiff, scratchy, silk-like fabric with a crinkled texture, and it was notoriously uncomfortable. It was hot, it was itchy, and the black dye would often rub off on the skin. A widow would be shrouded in it, a crepe dress, a crepe bonnet, and a long, heavy crepe veil that completely obscured her face when she went outside. The only jewelry permitted was jet, a black, fossilized wood, or jewelry made from the hair of the deceased. Yes, you heard that right. Hair jewelry was a massive trend. Brooches, rings, bracelets, and even intricate, wreath-like pictures were made by weaving the hair of a lost loved one. It sounds incredibly morbid to us, but for the Victorians, it was a way of keeping a physical part of the person with them. It was a sentimental, if slightly creepy, memento. After a year and a day, the widow could move into second mourning. This period lasted for about 9 months. She could finally take off the suffocating crepe veil. Her dresses still had to be black, but she could use slightly more luxurious fabrics like silk or velvet. She could begin to re-enter society, but only in a very limited way, small, quiet gatherings, but still no balls or celebratory events. Finally, after about 2 years, she could progress to half-mourning. This was the final stage. She could start to reintroduce color into her wardrobe, but only muted, subdued colors like gray, mauve, lavender, and white. Bright colors were still forbidden. After about 6 months of half-mourning, she was finally considered to be out of mourning and could resume a normal social life and wear colors again. This timeline was incredibly strict. To come out of mourning too soon was a sign of disrespect to the deceased and a shocking lack of feeling. The entire community was watching and judging. And it wasn't just for husbands. The mourning periods for other relatives were all precisely calculated. Mourning for a parent was about a year. For a sibling, 6 months. For a grandparent, 6 months. For an aunt or uncle, 3 months. For a cousin, 6 weeks. Women had to have a whole section of their wardrobe dedicated to mourning clothes for various stages and various relatives. It was a huge expense and a logistical headache. This wasn't just about expressing grief. It was a public declaration of family loyalty and social status. Only the wealthy could afford to put their lives on hold and purchase an entire new wardrobe of mourning clothes. For them, grief was another performance, another opportunity to display their propriety and refinement. It was the most goth, over-the-top piece of performance art, and for Victorian women, it was just another chapter in the rulebook that governed their lives. Given this world of extreme physical and emotional restriction, it's not surprising that Victorian women were often seen as delicate, frail, and prone to illness. But the way society, and the male-dominated medical establishment, viewed female health is a whole weird chapter in itself. The prevailing medical theory of the time was that a woman's entire being, her physical health, her mental state, her personality, was governed by her reproductive system. The womb was seen as the command center of her body, and a misbehaving womb was the cause of nearly all female ailments. The most famous of these female maladies was hysteria. The word itself comes from the Greek hystera, meaning uterus. Doctors believed that the uterus could literally become detached and wander around the body, causing all sorts of problems, from anxiety and shortness of breath to fainting spells and emotional outbursts. The list of symptoms for hysteria was incredibly long and vague, including things like nervousness, irritability, tendency to cause trouble, and loss of appetite. Basically, any woman who wasn't perfectly placid, submissive, and cheerful could be diagnosed with hysteria. It became a catch-all diagnosis for female dissatisfaction. Was a woman unhappy in her marriage? Hysteria. Was she frustrated by her lack of intellectual opportunities? Hysteria. Was she simply reacting to a life of constant, suffocating pressure? Hysteria. It was a convenient way for society to dismiss legitimate female suffering as a medical problem, an inherent flaw in the female constitution, rather than a rational response to an oppressive environment. And the cures were often as bizarre as the diagnosis. The most famous was the pelvic massage, administered by a doctor, to induce a hysterical paroxysm, which we would now recognize as an orgasm. Doctors found this treatment to be incredibly time-consuming and tedious, which directly led to the invention of the vibrator in the late 19th century as a labor-saving medical device for physicians. Another common prescription was the rest cure, popularized by Dr. Silas Mitchell. This was often prescribed for women suffering from nerves or depression. The patient was confined to bed for 6 to 8 weeks, forbidden from reading, writing, sewing, or even feeding herself. She was to be completely isolated and do nothing but lie still and be fattened up with a high-calorie diet. The idea was to force her back into a state of childlike dependency. The writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman underwent this cure, and her horrifying experience inspired her famous short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, a chilling tale of a woman's descent into madness under the rest cure. Then there was the swoon, the faint. Fainting was so common among Victorian women that fainting couches, chaise lounges with a raised end to elevate the feet, were a standard piece of furniture in any well-to-do home. Why were they fainting all the time? Well, as we've discussed, the corsets were a major factor, restricting breathing and blood flow. But it was more than just that. Fainting was one of the few ways a woman could exert any kind of control or express overwhelming emotion in a society that denied her a voice. It was a form of nonverbal communication. A well-timed faint could stop an unpleasant conversation, get you out of a boring social engagement, or garner you a great deal of sympathy and attention. In a world where women were supposed to be passionless and composed, a faint was a dramatic, socially acceptable way to say, "This is too much. I cannot handle this." It was the ultimate rage quit, the Victorian equivalent of dramatically storming out of a room and slamming the door. It was a physical expression of the powerlessness they felt in their daily lives. The general attitude towards female bodies was one of mystery and fear. Menstruation was a taboo topic, referred to only in whispers as the vapors or the flowers. It was seen as a time of illness and instability. Pregnancy was also shrouded in secrecy. A pregnant woman would go into confinement for the last few months of her pregnancy, withdrawing from society entirely so as not to offend public decency with the visible evidence of a physical, sexual act. This strange relationship with their own biology, a mix of shame and medical misinformation, just added another layer of anxiety to the already overburdened lives of Victorian women. Even the act of writing a letter, something we do in seconds with an email or a text, was a labyrinth of etiquette for a Victorian woman. The quality of your stationery was the first signal of your class. Good, thick paper was a must. For a lady, the paper was often small, and colors like pale pink, blue, or violet were acceptable for friendly correspondence, but pure white or cream was the standard for formal letters. The ink had to be black. Using colored ink was seen as eccentric and a bit common. Your handwriting, your hand, was incredibly important. A neat, elegant, flowing script was a sign of a good education and a refined character. A messy or scrawled handwriting was a moral failing. The way you wrote the letter was also governed by rules. You would start with the date in the top right corner. The salutation, "My dear Mrs. Smith," was standard. The content of the letter should be polite and well-constructed. You didn't just dash off your thoughts. A letter was a carefully composed piece of writing. And you never, ever crossed your lines. Paper was expensive, so some people would save space by writing a full page, then turning the page 90 degrees and writing over the top of their own text. For a lady of quality, this was a major faux pas. It suggested you were stingy. You were expected to leave a generous margin and start a new sheet when you ran out of room. Closing the letter was another ritual. Yours sincerely, yours faithfully, yours affectionately, each one carried a different level of intimacy. You had to choose the right one for your recipient. Then you signed your name. A married woman would sign with her husband's name, for example, Mrs. John Dashwood. She was, in essence, his property. Sealing the letter was the final flourish. You didn't just lick the envelope. You used sealing wax. The color of the wax mattered. Black was used for morning correspondence. Red was for business or legal letters. Other colors could be used for personal letters, and a lady might have a personal seal, a signet, with her initial or a family crest to press into the hot wax. The postage stamp even had a secret language, though this was more of a popular fad than a strict rule. Depending on the angle at which you placed the stamp on the envelope, you could send a secret message. A stamp placed upside down might mean, "I love you." A stamp placed sideways could mean, "My heart is another's." It was another example of the Victorian obsession with coded, hidden communication. A letter wasn't just a message, it was an artifact, a carefully constructed performance of your identity. So, after navigating all these social minefields, a woman finally achieved the ultimate goal, marriage. But what happened then? Did she finally get some freedom? In a word, no. In many ways, her life became even more constrained. Upon marriage, a woman in the 19th century underwent what was called civil death. Under the legal doctrine of coverture, a husband and wife were considered one person in the eyes of the law, and that person was the husband. A married woman had no separate legal identity. She could not own property in her own name. Any wages she earned, any inheritance she received, automatically belonged to her husband. She could not enter into contracts, sue someone, or be sued. Her husband was legally responsible for her actions, as if she were a child. And he had the legal right to control her, which included the right to use physical force, chastisement, as long as he didn't cause permanent injury. Divorce was almost impossible to obtain for a woman, and if she did manage it, she would lose her children, her property, and her social standing. Her role was now to be the manager of her husband's home, the angel in the house we talked about earlier. She was in charge of the servants, the household budget, which was given to her by her husband, and the social calendar. She was expected to create a peaceful, beautiful, and efficient domestic haven for her husband to return to after his hard day's work in the public sphere. Her body was no longer her own. It was her duty to produce children, specifically male heirs, to carry on the family name. Marital relations were seen as a wifely duty, not something to be enjoyed. A woman was expected to submit to her husband's desires, and the idea of female pleasure was considered unladylike and even pathological. Her friendships and social life were also subject to her husband's approval. Her primary identity was no longer as an individual, but as Mrs. So-and-so. Her own ambitions, her own desires, were expected to be completely sublimated to the needs of her husband and her family. For many women, marriage was not the happy ending of a romantic novel. It was the beginning of a life of quiet servitude, a gilded cage where they were financially secure and socially respectable, but had lost all personal autonomy. The home, which was supposed to be her sacred sphere of influence, could also become her private prison. It's easy to look back at all of this and see Victorian women as passive victims, delicate flowers crushed by an oppressive system. And while they were certainly constrained, it's also important to remember that they were not mindless dolls. Within this incredibly restrictive framework, many women found ways to exert power, to communicate, and to push back. The complex social rules, while oppressive, were also a system that women themselves mastered and controlled. A high society hostess, by managing her guest list, her seating chart, and her social calls, was acting as a powerful gatekeeper of society. She had the power to include or exclude, to make or break a person's social career. The cut direct was a woman's weapon. The subtle slight in the drawing room was her battle tactic. They became masters of passive aggression and subtext because it was the only language of power available to them. The secret languages of fans and flowers were a form of covert communication, a way to express desire and intent in a world that tried to render them silent. Even the illnesses, like hysteria and fainting, while rooted in real suffering, could be a subconscious form of protest, a way for the body to scream what the voice could not. And by the end of the Victorian era, things were beginning to change. The new woman emerged in the 1880s and 90s. She was a figure of both excitement and public panic. The new woman was educated, she had opinions, she might work a job as a teacher or a journalist. She cycled, she wore more practical clothing, goodbye, crinoline, and she might even choose not to marry at all. She was the forerunner of the suffragette, the first sign of a seismic shift in the role of women in society. She was a direct challenge to the ideal of the angel in the house. The fight was long and incredibly difficult, but it's important to see that the seeds of resistance were there, even in the most restrictive of times. Women found ways to carve out spaces for themselves, to build intense female friendships, to express themselves through writing and art, and to subtly undermine the very system that was designed to contain them. They were not just victims of their time, they were also survivors, strategists, and quiet rebels. So, after wading through this ocean of starched collars, tactical swoons, and the high-stakes drama of the calling card, what does this all really say about them? And what does it say about us? It's tempting to look back at these bizarre etiquette rules and just laugh at them as the silly, arbitrary customs of a bygone era. And they are funny. The idea of a social crisis over an asparagus spear is objectively hilarious. But if we stop there, we miss the point. These rules weren't just random. They were the threads of a vast, intricate net designed to maintain a very specific social order. It was a system built on class anxiety, patriarchal control, and a deep-seated fear of social change. Every rule, from how you held your teacup to how long you had to wear black for a dead cousin, was a mechanism for reinforcing that order. It was a way to make power structures seem natural, to encode them into the very fabric of daily life until they became as invisible and essential as breathing. The life of a respectable Victorian woman was a performance. A lifelong, high-stakes, exhausting performance. Her clothes were a costume, her home was a stage, and the etiquette book was her script. And the purpose of this performance was to prove her value, not as an individual, but as a symbol of her family's status and morality. The weirdness of the rules is a direct measure of the intensity of the pressure she was under. But perhaps the most revealing takeaway is this. For all the absurdity, the core desires and fears that drove this system are not alien to us. The desperate need to fit in. The anxiety of being judged. The use of signals, whether it's a folded calling card or a curated Instagram feed, to project a certain version of ourselves to the world. The desire to find a partner, to build a secure life, to be seen as successful and correct. We no longer worry about the language of the fan, but we agonize over the subtext of a text message. We don't have chaperones, but we have public social media accounts that are scrutinized by our peers. We've traded the corset for other, more metaphorical, kinds of restrictions. The stage has changed, the props are different, but the human performance continues. And by understanding the beautiful, terrifying, and utterly exhausting performance of Victorian womanhood, we can perhaps see our own modern performances just a little more clearly. Alright, so how did they create this perfect, porcelain, rule-abiding woman in the first place? She wasn't born knowing how to deploy a fan or orchestrate a dinner party. Oh no. She was forged. The creation of a Victorian lady was a deliberate, lifelong process that began in the nursery. Let's talk about the boot camp for future angels in the house, Victorian childhood and education. From the moment of birth, the paths of boys and girls diverged dramatically. A baby boy was seen as a future leader, a builder of empires, a creature of action and intellect. A baby girl was a future wife and mother, a creature of emotion and domesticity. Their toys reflected this. Boys got soldiers, building blocks, and toy trains, things that encouraged engagement with the outside world. Girls got dolls, dollhouses, and miniature tea sets, things that trained them for their future domestic role. The dollhouse wasn't just a toy, it was a training simulator for running a household. The tea set wasn't just for play, it was practice for the endless social rituals that would define her adult life. As we touched on earlier, children of the upper and middle classes were not primarily raised by their parents. They lived in a separate world within the house, the nursery, ruled over by a nanny. They saw their mother and father at scheduled times, often for a formal goodnight kiss or a brief, dressed-up appearance in the drawing room before dinner. This emotional distance was considered proper. Too much coddling or affection was thought to spoil a child. The relationship was one of authority and duty, not warm, fuzzy intimacy. When a girl was old enough, usually around 6 or 7, the nanny was replaced by a governess. The governess was a crucial, and often tragic, figure in the Victorian household. She was usually an educated, middle-class woman who had fallen on hard times and had to work for a living, one of the very few respectable jobs open to her. She lived in a strange social limbo. She wasn't family, but she wasn't a servant. She ate her meals alone, a ghost in the machinery of the house. Her job was to take the raw material of a little girl and sculpt her into a lady. And what was on the curriculum? It was what I like to call an education in inoffensiveness. A boy's education focused on classics, mathematics, science, and history, subjects that train the mind for logic, debate, and the rigors of university and professional life. A girl's education was designed to do the opposite. It was meant to polish her, not to fill her with dangerous ideas or, heaven forbid, ambition. She would learn to read, of course, and to write in that elegant, looping script. She'd learn basic arithmetic, just enough to manage household accounts. She'd learn French, the language of high culture, and maybe a little Italian or German. But the bulk of her time was spent on those accomplishments we discussed. Hours upon hours were spent at the piano, practicing scales and parlor pieces. Not to become a concert pianist, but to be able to provide light entertainment for her future husband and his guests. She learned to sing, but her voice was trained to be sweet and delicate, never powerful. She learned to draw and paint watercolors, again, not to be a great artist, but to demonstrate her delicate sensibilities by sketching a nice flower or a placid landscape. Her reading was carefully censored. Science and politics were off limits. Novels were considered particularly dangerous. They were full of passion, romance, and ideas about love and individual desire, which could give a young girl unrealistic and disruptive expectations about marriage. If she read novels, they were heavily vetted moral tales. She was being programmed, systematically, to be pleasing, decorative, and intellectually unthreatening. Any sign of genuine intellectual curiosity or a strong opinion was stamped out as unladylike. Her education was not about opening her mind, but about carefully furnishing it, like a room, with a few, pre-approved, decorative objects. It was a long, slow, deliberate process of sanding down all her sharp edges until she was perfectly smooth, perfectly polished, and perfectly ready for the marriage market. Now, let's talk about the stage where this all played out, the physical space that both defined and confined her, the Victorian home. To our modern, minimalist sensibilities, the high Victorian interior is a visual assault, a chaotic explosion of stuff. But to the Victorians, it was a carefully constructed universe of meaning, and for the lady of the house, it was both her kingdom and her cage. The guiding principle of Victorian interior design could be described as horror vacui, a Latin term meaning fear of empty spaces. Every single surface had to be covered, draped, or decorated. Walls were covered in busy, floral-patterned wallpaper. On top of the wallpaper hung dozens of paintings, framed in heavy, ornate gilt. The floors were covered with thick, patterned carpets, often with smaller rugs layered on top. Windows were shrouded in multiple layers of heavy drapery, lace panels against the glass, then thick velvet or brocade curtains, often with an elaborate, carved pelmet on top. This wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about broadcasting wealth and status. Every object screamed, "We can afford this." The heavy curtains kept out not just the light and air, but also the prying eyes of the lower classes. They also trapped a phenomenal amount of dust and soot from the coal fires, making the air inside thick and stagnant. A Victorian home would have had a very specific smell, a mixture of coal smoke, beeswax polish, dust, and whatever heavy floral perfume the lady of the house was wearing. The furniture was dark, heavy, and ornately carved. And there was so much of it. Sofas, armchairs, side tables, display cabinets, whatnots, all crowded together, making the rooms feel smaller and more claustrophobic. And every horizontal surface was covered in what they called bric-a-brac, porcelain figurines, silver picture frames, souvenir spoons, seashells under glass domes, stuffed birds, wax fruit. It was a museum of personal and social history, and it was the lady's job to cure it and maintain it. Dusting a Victorian parlor must have been a Herculean task, performed, of course, by a fleet of maids. The house was strictly zoned. The parlor, or drawing room, was the public face of the family. It was the most elaborately decorated room, a stage set for receiving guests. This was where the calling cards were displayed, where the hostess presided over tea, and where the family performed its respectability. It was a room designed for show, not for comfort. The furniture was often stiff and formal, arranged for conversation, not relaxation. The dining room was another formal, public space, a theater for the drama of the dinner party. But other rooms were private. The master bedroom was the husband's domain, but it was also one of the few places where his wife could let her guard down, at least physically. This was where she would be unlaced from her corset, where she could finally breathe. But even here, privacy was a relative concept. A lady's maid would be in and out, helping her dress and undress, arranging her hair. For a woman, the home was her entire world. Men had the club, the office, the political chamber. They could move freely between the public and private spheres. But a respectable woman's life was almost entirely contained within the four walls of her house. It was her sanctuary, protecting her from the dirt and dangers of the outside world. But it was also her prison. Those heavy curtains didn't just keep the world out, they also kept her in. The sheer weight of all those objects, all that clutter, can be seen as a metaphor for the weight of the social expectations and rules that cluttered her own life, leaving very little empty space for her own thoughts or desires. Of course, the lady of the house was not alone in this gilded cage. She was surrounded by, and in charge of, an entire ecosystem of people who made her lifestyle of decorative idleness possible, the servants. The relationship between a Victorian mistress and her staff was one of the most complex and fraught dynamics of the era. It was a bizarre mixture of intimacy and rigid class hierarchy, of dependency and authority. A moderately well-off middle-class family might have one or two servants, a maid-of-all-work and perhaps a cook. But a wealthy, upper-class household was a small army. There was a strict hierarchy, below stairs. At the top was the butler, who managed the male servants, and the housekeeper, who managed the female staff. Under them were footmen, coachmen, cooks, scullery maids, parlor maids, ladies' maids, and nursery maids. The population of the servants' quarters could easily outnumber the family living upstairs. The lady of the house was the commander-in-chief of this domestic army. It was one of the few areas where she could wield real power. Her day began with meeting the housekeeper and the cook to approve menus, go over the household accounts, and assign tasks for the day. She was a manager, a CEO of a small corporation whose product was a smooth, elegant, and respectable lifestyle for her family. But this power came with a heavy dose of anxiety. She was completely dependent on her servants. They saw everything. They heard everything. They knew the family's secrets. The parlor maid dusting the bric-a-brac heard the hushed arguments. The lady's maid lacing her mistress into her corset knew about her health problems, her moods, her secret sorrows. The servants' hall was a hotbed of gossip, a below-stairs intelligence agency. A disgruntled servant could ruin a family's reputation with a few well-placed whispers to the staff of another household. The mistress had to maintain a careful balance. She had to be firm and authoritative, to ensure the household ran like clockwork. But she couldn't be a tyrant, or her servants would leave, or worse, gossip. She was also expected to be a moral guide for her staff, particularly the young female servants, who were seen as being in her care. She might lead them in daily prayers or inspect their living quarters to ensure they were clean and orderly. The relationship with the lady's maid was the most intimate of all. This was the servant who worked most closely with the mistress. She helped her dress and undress, did her hair, cared for her clothes and jewelry, and often became a confidant. She was the keeper of her mistress's most private secrets. Yet, despite this physical and emotional intimacy, the vast gulf of class always remained between them. They could be close, but they could never be equals. For the mistress, the servants were a constant presence, a permanent audience for her life's performance. There was no real privacy. Even in her own bedroom, she was never truly alone. The walls had ears, and the ears were wearing starched caps and aprons. This constant surveillance added yet another layer of pressure to her already scrutinized existence. She was not just performing for her social equals, she was performing for her inferiors, always conscious that her every action was being observed, judged, and likely discussed in detail the moment she left the room. Now, let's zoom in on a subject that is a perfect storm of weirdness, social pressure, and outright danger: Victorian beauty and hygiene. The ideal of female beauty was a pale, delicate, almost translucent creature. A healthy tan was the mark of a field worker, someone who had to be outside. A lady of leisure cultivated a pallor that advertised her indoor existence. She was supposed to look fragile, as if a strong gust of wind might knock her over. This was the consumptive chic, the romanticization of the symptoms of tuberculosis, which included pale skin, flushed cheeks, and a languid, frail demeanor. But how did you achieve this look? Makeup as we know it, obvious lipstick, rouge, and eyeshadow, was completely taboo for a respectable woman. To be painted was to be an actress or a prostitute. The goal was to look naturally beautiful, which, ironically, required a huge amount of artifice and some very dangerous chemistry. To get that coveted pale skin, women would powder their faces, necks, and chests with a fine white powder. The cheaper versions were made from rice flour or cornstarch. But the more expensive, and more effective, powders were lead-based. Women were literally poisoning themselves, dusting their skin daily with a heavy metal that could cause everything from nerve damage to paralysis and death. Some even went a step further, using wafers of arsenic, which they would either eat or use to create a face wash. Arsenic, in small doses, did make the skin look pale and luminous, and it made the eyes sparkle. It also, slowly killed you. For that delicate, rosy flush on the cheeks, a lady couldn't just apply blush. Instead, she might discreetly bite her lips and pinch her cheeks before entering a room to bring the blood to the surface. Or she might use a very subtle rouge made from beetroot juice or crushed carmine beetles, applied with the utmost secrecy and then carefully blended to look like a natural blush of maidenly modesty. The eyes were also supposed to be bright and alluring. Some women would drop belladonna into their eyes. Belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, would dilate the pupils, creating a wide-eyed, dreamy look that was considered very attractive. It also blurred vision and, over time, could lead to blindness. So, to recap, the ideal beauty routine involved lead, arsenic, and deadly nightshade. It was less of a cosmetic regimen and more of a slow, aesthetically pleasing suicide pact. Hair care was another ordeal. A woman's hair was considered her crowning glory, and it was rarely cut. Women had incredibly long hair, which they would pile up on their heads in elaborate styles with braids, curls, and twists. Washing this massive amount of hair was a major undertaking, done maybe once a month. Shampoos were not widely available, so women would wash their hair with concoctions of egg yolks, rosemary tea, or even diluted ammonia. To keep it looking fresh between washes, they would brush it vigorously, sometimes 100 strokes a night, to distribute the oils and remove dirt. They would also dry shampoo it with powdered orris root or cornmeal. And perfume. Perfume was a social weapon. But again, it had to be subtle. A lady would never douse herself in scent. Instead, she would apply a drop to her handkerchief or the inside of her gloves. The scents themselves were heavy and floral: violet, rose, jasmine, and lily of the valley were popular. Each scent was also thought to carry a meaning. Violet, for example, signified modesty and faithfulness. A woman's choice of perfume was another subtle signal of her character. As for hygiene, while the Victorians were obsessed with public propriety, private cleanliness was a bit more variable. Daily bathing was not the norm for everyone. A full bath in a tub was a weekly, or even less frequent, event for many. Sponge baths at a washstand in the bedroom were more common. And deodorant did not exist. People tried to mask body odor with perfume and by using dress shields, absorbent pads tacked into the armpits of their dresses to protect the fabric from sweat stains. Can you imagine the smell of a crowded ballroom in the middle of summer? A heady mix of heavy perfumes, coal dust, and a whole lot of undeodorized humanity packed into tight-lacing corsets. It's a sensory experience I think we can all be glad we missed. So, with all these rules, all this pressure, this constant performance, what happened if a woman broke the rules? What happened if she slipped from the tightrope? The Victorians had a very clear, and very brutal, concept for this, the fallen woman. A woman's entire value in society was tied up in her reputation, and her reputation was tied to her sexual purity. If she lost her virginity before marriage, or had an affair after marriage, she was ruined. And ruin was not just a dramatic word, it was a literal social death. A fallen woman was a ghost. Her family would disown her. Her friends would cut her off. She would be barred from respectable society. Her name would not be spoken. It was as if she had ceased to exist. For a woman with no legal rights, no ability to own property, and very few ways to earn a living, this was a terrifying prospect. The double standard was, of course, staggering. A man who had premarital affairs was just sowing his wild oats. It was expected, even seen as a normal part of his development. A married man who kept a mistress was discreetly tolerated, as long as he didn't cause a public scandal. His actions had almost no bearing on his social standing. But for a woman, a single misstep meant complete and utter annihilation. This fear of ruin was the ultimate tool of control. It was the threat that underpinned all the other rules. Why must you have a chaperone? To prevent ruin. Why must you not speak to a man you haven't been introduced to? To prevent ruin. Why must you dress modestly, speak softly, and never have a strong opinion? To prevent any hint of impropriety that could lead to rumor, which could lead to ruin. The entire elaborate structure of female etiquette was a fortress built to protect a woman's chastity, the single commodity that determined her worth. The fate of a fallen woman was bleak. With no family or social support, many were forced into prostitution to survive. The streets of Victorian London were teeming with prostitutes, a visible and disturbing reminder to respectable women of what could happen if they strayed from the path. Other fallen women might end up in workhouses, or in one of the infamous Magdalene laundries, harsh, punitive institutions run by religious orders where penitent women were forced to do backbreaking laundry work for the rest of their lives. Even the portrayal of the fallen woman in art and literature was designed to be a cautionary tale. She was always beautiful, tragic, and doomed. She would inevitably die of consumption, or drown herself in the Thames, punished for her transgression against the social order. There was no redemption, no second chances. This brutal, unforgiving system created an environment of intense paranoia and judgment. Women were encouraged to police each other. A woman who was seen to be too friendly with men, or who dressed a little too fashionably, would be the subject of vicious gossip. It was a way for other women to reinforce their own respectability by casting suspicion on another. In a system that pitted them against each other for the grand prize of a suitable husband, there was very little room for sisterhood or solidarity. The fear of falling was so great that it often turned women into the most effective enforcers of the very rules that oppressed them. So, let's expand our horizons a bit. A Victorian lady's life wasn't entirely confined to the home and the immediate neighborhood. The 19th century was the age of the railway, the steamship, and the dawn of modern tourism. But if you think a woman could just pack a bag and go on an adventure, you have not been paying attention. Travel for a Victorian lady was just her gilded cage, but on wheels. First, let's talk about luggage. A lady did not travel light. Ever. A simple weekend trip to the country would require a mountain of luggage. She needed multiple outfits for every possible time of day and social situation, a sturdy traveling dress, morning dresses, afternoon dresses, several elaborate dinner gowns, and a ball gown, just in case. Each of these outfits required its own specific set of undergarments, shoes, hats, gloves, and jewelry. This all went into enormous trunks called portmanteaus. It was a logistical operation on a military scale, all managed by her lady's maid, who would also have her own luggage. The arrival of a single woman and her maid at a country house could look like a small army was moving in. And, of course, she couldn't travel alone. For an unmarried woman, a chaperone was non-negotiable. She was a human passport, her presence vouching for the young lady's respectability. For a married woman, she would travel with her husband or, at the very least, her maid. The idea of a woman traveling solo was scandalous. What could she possibly be doing on her own? What dangers might she encounter? Or, more to the point, what trouble might she get into? A woman alone was a woman outside of male protection and control, and Victorian society simply couldn't compute that. The train journey itself was a performance. First-class carriages were designed to be like drawing rooms on wheels, upholstered in plush velvet and decorated with polished wood. A lady would be settled into her seat by her husband or a porter. She would have a book, her needlepoint, and perhaps a lap rug. She was not to engage in conversation with strangers, especially not strange men. A man who tried to speak to an unchaperoned lady on a train was considered a cad of the highest order. The journey was to be passed in quiet, respectable contemplation. Hotels were another social minefield. A respectable hotel would have separate, more private entrances for ladies. They would also have ladies' drawing rooms, or ladies' lounges, where women could sit and read without having to mix with the general, and potentially unsavory, male clientele of the main lobby. A woman could not simply check into a hotel by herself. It was assumed she was a prostitute. She had to be part of a family group, under the clear authority of a husband or father. Then there was the Grand Tour of Europe, the ultimate finishing school for the children of the aristocracy. Young men went to sow their wild oats and absorb culture. Young women went, heavily chaperoned, to be polished. They would trail through the museums of Italy and the chateaux of France, not to learn, but to acquire a veneer of continental culture that would make them more marriageable. They were there to look at art, not to have ideas about it. Their travel journals were expected to be full of delicate observations about sunsets and picturesque ruins, not sharp critiques of foreign politics. Even the most adventurous travel was framed within the context of domesticity. As the British Empire expanded, many women traveled to far-flung colonies like India or Africa to join their husbands who were serving as administrators or military officers. But they didn't go native. They went to recreate a little slice of England in the tropics. They set up households with legions of local servants, held formal dinner parties in the sweltering heat, and worried endlessly about maintaining English standards of propriety in a heathen land. For the Victorian lady, travel wasn't about escaping her world, it was about stamping her world onto every new place she went. Okay, so life wasn't all just sitting in drawing rooms and avoiding social blunders. They did have fun. Sort of. But even Victorian leisure was hemmed in by 1,000 rules, especially for women. The idea of fun for fun's sake was a bit suspect. Leisure activities had to be genteel, respectable, and, ideally, offer some opportunity for a little light, heavily supervised, courtship. Let's start with the great outdoor crazes of the latter half of the century. One of the most popular was croquet. On the surface, it's a placid, gentle game. You hit a wooden ball with a mallet through a series of hoops. But in the Victorian era, the croquet lawn was a social battlefield. It was one of the few places where young, unmarried men and women could interact in a relatively informal setting. And they took full advantage of it. A gentleman could offer to help a lady line up her shot, allowing for a moment of sanctioned closeness. A lady could accidentally send her ball rolling near a handsome young man, giving him an excuse to retrieve it for her and strike up a conversation. The game itself was rife with opportunities for passive-aggressive combat. A ruthless player might send an opponent's ball flying into the bushes, a move that could be interpreted as either a clever tactic or a pointed social snub. The croquet lawn, with its green grass and birdsong, was the Victorian equivalent of a nightclub, a place of flirtation, rivalry, and high drama, all conducted with mallets and colored balls. Then came lawn tennis. When it was introduced in the 1870s, it was a sensation. But how could a woman play a physically active game while encased in a corset, a bustle, and multiple layers of petticoats? The answer is, with great difficulty. Early female tennis players played in their everyday clothes. They couldn't run, they mostly just stood in place and patted the ball back and forth over the net. To even show an ankle was a scandal, so the skirts remained floor-length. A bead of sweat on a lady's brow was unseemly, so the game was played at a very, very slow pace. It was less of a sport and more of a posing session with rackets. The seaside holiday also became a massive trend, thanks to the expansion of the railways. Families would decamp to places like Brighton or Scarborough for weeks at a time. But a day at the beach was not the casual affair it is today. A lady would sit on the sand, fully dressed, under a parasol to protect her pale skin from the dreaded sun. If she wanted to actually go in the water, she had to use a bathing machine. This was a small wooden hut on wheels. She would get changed inside the hut into a cumbersome bathing costume, which was basically a flannel dress worn over bloomers. Then, the entire hut would be rolled into the water by a horse or an attendant. She would emerge from the back of the machine, down some steps, directly into the sea, so that no one on the shore could glimpse her figure in her wet, clinging costume. After a brief, decorous dip, she would retreat back into the machine to be rolled ashore. It was the most absurdly complicated way to go for a swim ever devised, all in the name of protecting female modesty from the prying eyes of men. For indoor entertainment, there was the theater, the opera, and concerts. A night at the theater was a major social event. A family would book a private box, which was like a mini drawing room overlooking the stage. What you wore was just as important as the play itself. This was an opportunity to show off your finest gowns and jewels. But your behavior was strictly monitored. A lady was to sit quietly and applaud politely at the appropriate moments. To be too emotional, to weep openly at a tragic scene or laugh too loudly at a comedy, was a sign of poor breeding. The real drama, for many attendees, was not on the stage, but in the audience, who was there, who they were with, and what they were wearing. There was, however, a racier, more scandalous form of entertainment, the music hall. Music halls were the Victorian equivalent of vaudeville, with singers, comedians, and dancers. They were loud, boisterous, and associated with the working classes and men of questionable morals. A respectable lady would never, ever be seen in a music hall. It was a world away from the staid, controlled environments she was used to, a world of energy, vulgarity, and freedom that was completely forbidden to her. In this world of extreme emotional and intellectual repression, it's no surprise that many Victorians, particularly women, sought an outlet in a realm that was completely beyond the control of fathers, husbands, or society, the spirit world. The second half of the 19th century saw a massive explosion of interest in spiritualism, seances, and communication with the dead. It was a full-blown craze, and women were at the very heart of it. A seance was a gathering, usually held in a darkened parlor, where a group of people would sit around a table and attempt to contact spirits, usually with the help of a medium. The medium, who was very often a woman, claimed to be able to channel the dead. The lights would be dimmed, hands would be held, and soon, strange phenomena would begin. A table might levitate or knock on the floor in response to questions. A disembodied voice might whisper from a corner of the room. A ghostly hand might appear and touch a sitter's cheek. To us, it sounds like a parlor game, a bit of spooky fun. But for many Victorians, this was deeply serious. In an age of high mortality, almost everyone had lost a loved one, a child, a spouse, a sibling. The séance offered something that organized religion often couldn't: direct, personal, and immediate comfort. It was a chance to hear from a lost child that they were happy in the afterlife, or to receive guidance from a deceased husband. Why was this so appealing to women? For one, it was an emotional release valve. In a culture that demanded they suppress their grief and maintain a stiff upper lip, the séance was a safe space to cry, to mourn openly, and to express the deep emotions they had to keep hidden in their daily lives. It was a form of group therapy, conducted in the dark. Furthermore, it was one of the only arenas where women could have real spiritual authority. Mainstream churches were run by men. But the spirit world seemed to prefer female messengers. The medium was a powerful figure. She was the center of attention, the conduit to a higher plane. In the trance state, she could speak with a confidence and authority that would be unthinkable for a woman in a normal social setting. For women who were silenced and ignored in every other aspect of their lives, being a medium was a way to have a voice, and a very powerful one at that. Of course, the whole scene was rife with fraud. Mediums used all sorts of tricks, hidden assistants, cleverly designed tables, and devices that could make spooky noises. But the believers wanted to believe. The comfort it provided was so profound that they were willing to overlook the flimsy evidence. The séance craze reveals a deep spiritual hunger and emotional desperation lurking just beneath the placid, respectable surface of Victorian life. It was a secret, candlelit rebellion against a world that was rational, patriarchal, and emotionally sterile. It was a way for women to find a voice in the silence, even if that voice had to pretend to come from beyond the grave. Now, let's step back and look at the bigger picture. Why was the marriage market so incredibly competitive? Why was the pressure on young women so intense? A huge part of the answer lies in a simple, brutal demographic fact that haunted the Victorian era, the surplus women problem. Census after census revealed that in Great Britain, there were significantly more women than men. We're talking hundreds of thousands more women. For a society that defined a woman's entire existence by her ability to marry and have children, this was a major crisis. It created a huge population of unmarried women, or spinsters, with no clear role or purpose in the social order. The term spinster itself, which originally just meant a woman who spins thread, became a term of pity and sometimes scorn. An unmarried woman was seen as a failure, a leftover from the marriage market. This demographic imbalance ratcheted up the pressure on every young woman. It wasn't just about finding a good husband, it was about finding a husband at all. It turned courtship into a high-stakes game of musical chairs, where there were never enough chairs for all the players. This is why mothers, the infamous matchmaking mamas, were so ruthless in their pursuit of eligible bachelors for their daughters. They knew the numbers were not in their favor. So what happened to the women who didn't marry? Their options were bleak. For a wealthy woman, she might live with a married sibling's family, becoming the maiden aunt. She was often a useful, unpaid babysitter and household helper, but she was also a figure of pity, a permanent resident in someone else's life story. For a middle-class woman without a family fortune to fall back on, the situation was much more precarious. There were very few respectable professions open to her. The most common was to become a governess, like we discussed earlier. But this was a lonely, thankless job. Another option was to be a companion to an elderly, wealthy lady, a role that was essentially a high-class servant. The surplus women problem became a major topic of public debate. What was society to do with all these unmarried, redundant women? Some people suggested they should be shipped off to the colonies, where there were more men than women. Emigration societies were set up specifically for this purpose. Others began to argue for a more radical solution, that women needed better education and more opportunities for employment. This was the beginning of the push for women to be admitted to universities and to enter professions like nursing, teaching, and eventually, office work. The figure of the surplus woman is crucial to understanding the Victorian mindset. She was a ghost at the feast, a constant reminder of the failure that awaited any woman who couldn't secure a husband. Her existence fueled the desperation of the marriage market and, paradoxically, also fueled the first sparks of the feminist movement. She was the problem that the rigid patriarchal system couldn't solve, and her plight ultimately helped to expose the cracks in its very foundation. So how did women learn this impossibly complex set of rules? It wasn't just from their mothers and governesses. They were also being constantly programmed by a powerful new force in the 19th century, the mass media. Specifically, the ladies' magazine. Publications like Godey's Lady's Book in America and the Englishwoman's Domestic Magazine in Britain were the Victorian equivalent of the Internet, Vogue, and Goop all rolled into one. And they were wildly popular, reaching hundreds of thousands of readers. These magazines were the Bibles of domesticity and propriety. They were a monthly instruction manual on how to be the perfect woman. Each issue would be filled with sentimental short stories and poems that reinforced traditional values, tales of dutiful wives, self-sacrificing mothers, and pious daughters. There would be sheet music for the latest parlor songs, and patterns for intricate embroidery projects. A key feature was the fashion plate. These were beautifully hand-colored illustrations showcasing the latest styles from Paris. A woman could see exactly what kind of dress, bonnet, and hairstyle was considered fashionable that season, and then either attempt to make it herself or take it to her dressmaker. These plates were instrumental in spreading fashion trends and creating a uniform look for the respectable woman. But the most important part of these magazines was the advice columns and etiquette guides. They offered explicit, detailed instructions on every imaginable social situation. Here are some actual examples of the kind of advice they dished out. On conversation, one guide warned, "Never seem wiser or more learned than the people you are with. Wear your learning like a pocket watch, and do not pull it out to show that you have one." On declining a dance, a woman was instructed, "It is a great rudeness to refuse one gentleman and then accept another for the same dance." On street etiquette, a lady should not stop on the street to talk with a gentleman. A bow of recognition is all that is allowable. They covered everything, down to the tiniest detail. How to enter a room. How to accept a gift. How to write a letter of condolence. How to manage your servants. For women who lived in more isolated rural areas, or for the newly rich middle-class families who were anxious to fit in with high society, these magazines were an indispensable guide. They were selling an instruction manual for social climbing. Reading these magazines today is a wild ride. They are a direct window into the anxieties and aspirations of the Victorian woman. They reveal a world obsessed with tiny details, terrified of making a mistake, and desperate to project an image of perfect, effortless refinement. They were a powerful tool for enforcing conformity, for creating a standardized model of femininity that millions of women were encouraged to emulate. They were the propaganda machine that built the angel in the house, one fashion plate and etiquette tip at a time. Now, everything we've talked about so far, the calling cards, the corsets, the dinner parties, this was the reality for a very small, very privileged slice of the population. For the vast majority of women in the Victorian era, the working class, these rules might as well have been from another planet. Their lives were not governed by etiquette, they were governed by the relentless, brutal realities of poverty and survival. Let's imagine the life of a young woman working in a textile factory in Manchester. She doesn't wake up to a maid bringing her breakfast in bed. She wakes up before dawn in a crowded, cold tenement room she shares with her entire family. There's no running water, no sanitation. The air in the street is thick with coal smoke. Her costume for the day is not a carefully chosen gown. It's a simple, patched dress and a shawl. There's no corset to give her a fashionable figure, her body is shaped by malnutrition and hard labor. She walks to the factory, where she will spend the next 12 to 14 hours in a deafeningly loud, dangerous environment. The air is filled with cotton dust that clogs her lungs. The machinery is unfenced, and accidents are common. A moment of inattention could mean losing a finger, a hand, or her life. Her accomplishments are not playing the piano or sketching. Her accomplishments are speed and efficiency at the loom. Her hands are not soft and delicate, they are calloused and stained. There's no time for polite, circular conversation. The noise of the factory makes talking almost impossible anyway. When her shift is over, she walks home in the dark, collects her meager wages, and gives them to her family. Her dinner is not a multi-course affair, it's likely a piece of bread and some thin soup. There is no drawing room, no social calls. Her leisure time is a few precious hours of exhaustion before she has to get up and do it all again. Or what about a domestic servant, the woman who made that angel in the house lifestyle possible. Her life was a strange paradox. She lived in a grand house, surrounded by luxury, but none of it was hers. She saw the performance of gentility up close, but she was always backstage. Her days started before the family woke up and ended long after they went to bed. She was on her feet for 16 hours a day, cleaning grates, hauling coal and water, scrubbing floors, and always being invisible. She had to follow a strict set of rules, but they weren't about which fork to use. They were rules like, always use the back stairs, never speak unless spoken to, always face the wall when a member of the family passes you in a corridor. She had almost no privacy and no personal freedom. Her employer had complete control over her life. For these women, the elaborate etiquette of the upper classes was not just irrelevant, it was a symbol of the vast, unbridgeable chasm that separated their worlds. The delicate health of the lady of the house was made possible by the backbreaking labor of the scullery maid. The idleness of the rich woman was built on the exhaustion of the poor one. To understand the weirdness of Victorian etiquette, you have to understand the world of desperate, grinding poverty that it was designed to keep at a distance. The rules were a wall, built to separate the clean and respectable from the harsh realities of the world that the majority of people, and the majority of women, actually inhabited. So far, we've discussed what happens when a woman breaks the social rules. But what happened when she broke the actual law? The Victorian legal system's treatment of female criminals is a dark and fascinating reflection of their broader attitudes towards women. A woman was not supposed to be capable of violence or serious crime. She was the gentler sex, the moral center of the home. So, when a woman did commit a crime, she was seen as a monstrous anomaly, a creature who had defied her very nature. The types of crimes women were most often accused of were telling. Poisoning was often considered a woman's crime. It was clandestine, it required no physical strength, and it often took place in the domestic sphere, a wife poisoning her husband, for instance. The sensationalized media of the day, the penny dreadfuls, loved a good story about a female poisoner. She was portrayed as a cunning, unnatural monster, a domestic demon. The most common crime for women, however, was theft. For a woman living in poverty, with no social safety net and few ways to earn a living, stealing a loaf of bread or a piece of cloth could be the only way to feed her children. But the law made few allowances for desperation. If a woman was arrested and brought to trial, the courtroom itself was a hostile environment. She was being judged by an all-male jury, an all-male group of lawyers, and a male judge. Her testimony was often viewed with suspicion. Her fate depended heavily on whether she could perform the role of a proper woman. If she appeared penitent, tearful, and suitably feminine, she might receive a lighter sentence. If she was defiant, angry, or unladylike, she was likely to be treated much more harshly. Her character was on trial as much as her crime. If convicted, her punishment could be brutal. For minor offenses, she might be sent to the workhouse. For more serious crimes, she would be sent to prison. Women's prisons were grim, overcrowded places, with a harsh regime of silence, hard labor, and religious instruction, all designed to break her spirit and reform her into a more submissive, obedient woman. The ultimate punishment, of course, was execution. Public hangings were a popular form of entertainment for much of the Victorian era, and the execution of a notorious female murderer would draw massive, bloodthirsty crowds. The treatment of female criminals reveals the ultimate hypocrisy of the Victorian ideal of womanhood. Society placed women on a pedestal, calling them angels, but if they stepped off that pedestal, if they failed to live up to that impossible ideal, they were treated with a special kind of revulsion. They were not just criminals, they were freaks of nature, and the system was designed to crush them. So, after this 4-hour odyssey through the land of smelling salts, secret flower codes, arsenic wafers, and spiritualist trumpets, where does that leave us? What is the grand, unified theory of Victorian weirdness? It comes back to that central idea, performance. But now we see how all-encompassing that performance truly was. It wasn't just about performing for your social equals in the drawing room. It was about performing piety for God in church, performing authority for your servants below stairs, and performing fragility for the male doctors who held the keys to your physical and mental health. It was about performing a version of Englishness for the natives, in the colonies, and performing penitence for the all-male legal system if you fell afoul of the law. Every space, from the nursery to the prison cell, was another stage with another script. And we see more clearly now what lay outside the theater. We see the vast, churning world of the working class, whose lives were a different kind of performance, a grim, daily performance of survival. Their existence was the invisible scaffolding that held up the glittering stage of high society. The contrast is everything. The absurdity of the etiquette rules becomes sharper, more poignant, when you realize they were a luxury, a game played by a tiny minority whose leisure was bought with the labor of millions. We also see the desperate search for escape hatches. The séance, the sentimental novel, the secret languages, these were all attempts to find a space between the lines of the script, a way to express the grief, passion, and ambition that the official performance did not allow. These weren't just quirky fads, they were acts of psychological survival. They were the mind's desperate attempt to create a little pocket of freedom in a world that offered none. Ultimately, the story of the Victorian woman and her bizarre rules is a story about the terrifying power of ideals. The angel in the house was a beautiful, powerful idea. But it was also a phantom, an impossible standard that demanded the suppression of a woman's true self. It demanded she be selfless, passionless, and ambitionless. It demanded she shrink her body with corsets and her mind with a censored education. And the weirdness of the etiquette is the sound of an entire society contorting itself to try and make this phantom real. It's the sound of millions of individual women trying to squeeze their complex, messy, human selves into a beautiful, but suffocatingly small, box. And perhaps the most enduring lesson is a warning, to be wary of any ideal so perfect that it leaves no room for people to be human. Alright. For those of you still with me, you are a special kind of history nerd, and I salute you. We've been through the drawing room, the sick room, the factory floor, and the spirit world. We've dissected the calling card, the corset, and the cautionary tale of the fallen woman. But we've barely scratched the surface of the great, ritualized set pieces of a woman's life. So grab a fresh cup of whatever is getting you through this, settle back in, because we are now going to walk our Victorian heroine through the single most important day of her life. The day that all the training, all the accomplishments, all the excruciating etiquette was for. Let's talk about the Victorian wedding. If courtship was a military campaign, the wedding was the victory parade, the peace treaty, and the corporate merger all rolled into one. It was the moment a woman transitioned from being her father's property to her husband's. And every single second of it, from the engagement announcement to the honeymoon departure, was choreographed with the precision of a royal coronation. Let's start with the engagement. Once a man had proposed and been accepted, and, more importantly, her father had given his financial blessing, the couple was officially engaged. But this wasn't a time for romantic bliss. It was a time for logistics. The first rule, the engagement must be short. A long engagement was suspect. It suggested that perhaps the finances weren't in order, or that one party was having second thoughts. A typical engagement for the upper classes was 2 to 3 months. Just enough time to prepare for the onslaught of planning. The bride-to-be immediately went into a kind of social purdah. It was considered improper for an engaged couple to be seen out in public too often. They were certainly not to travel together or attend scandalous things like the theater. The idea was to keep the bride fresh and out of the public eye before her grand debut as a wife. Her primary, all-consuming task was the preparation of the trousseau. The trousseau was a bride's collection of clothing, linen, and personal items that she would bring to the marriage. And it was an undertaking of epic proportions. It was her entire wardrobe for the first few years of her married life. We're talking dozens of chemises, drawers, petticoats, and nightgowns, all exquisitely handmade and embroidered with her new initials. We're talking morning dresses, afternoon dresses, walking costumes, riding habits, dinner gowns, ball gowns. It was a material manifestation of her family's wealth and her own domestic virtue. The sheer amount of sewing involved was staggering. The bride and her female relatives would spend months stitching away. It was the original unboxing video, but in reverse, a slow, deliberate assembly of her new identity. Then there were the invitations. These were engraved on the finest white cardstock and worded in the most formal, third-person language imaginable. Mr. and Mrs. William Darcy request the honor of your presence at the marriage of their daughter, Elizabeth, to Mr. Fitzwilliam Bingley. The wording was a minefield. To use, honor of your presence, meant the wedding was in a church. To use, pleasure of your company, meant it was a more secular, at-home ceremony. Getting this wrong was a sign of being hopelessly middle class. And who you invited was a testament to your social standing. The guest list was a strategic document, carefully curated to include all the right people and, more importantly, to exclude all the wrong ones. To be left off the list for a society wedding was a brutal public snub. The wedding gifts were another display. Unlike today, where gifts are often for the couple, Victorian wedding gifts were overwhelmingly for the bride. Silver tea sets, fine china, jewelry, furniture. They were a way for friends and family to help establish her new home and to display their own wealth and generosity. The gifts would be put on display in the bride's home in the days leading up to the wedding, for all the guests to come and inspect. It was a ritualized showing off, a public accounting of the family's social capital. And now, the day itself. Queen Victoria is the one who popularized the white wedding dress when she married Prince Albert in 1840. Before that, brides just wore their best dress, of any color. But Victoria's choice of white, a symbol of purity and innocence, became the absolute standard. The dress itself would be a masterpiece of silk, satin, and lace, with a long train and a veil. The veil was crucial. It symbolized the bride's modesty and her status as an untouched maiden. The bride traveled to the church with her father. She was not to see the groom on the wedding day before the ceremony. The groom, meanwhile, waited at the altar with his best man. There were no groomsmen. He just had his one key supporter. The bride was escorted down the aisle by her father, who would then literally give her away to the groom, a very tangible symbol of the transfer of ownership. Bridesmaids were usually young, unmarried women, often the bride's sisters or cousins. They would be dressed in simpler dresses, so as not to outshine the bride. The ceremony itself was the solemn, traditional Church of England service. The bride's responses were expected to be soft, almost inaudible. To speak her vows too loudly was seen as unseemly and forward. After the ceremony, the couple would exit the church to the throwing of rice or flower petals, symbols of fertility. They would then proceed to the bride's family home for the wedding breakfast. This was not breakfast as we know it. It was an elaborate luncheon, held in the middle of the day. The centerpiece of the breakfast was the wedding cake. It was usually a dense fruit cake, covered in white royal icing. The bride would make the first cut, with the groom's hand placed over hers to help her, symbolizing his guidance and her submission. Speeches were given, toasts were made, and then the bride would disappear to change into her going-away dress, a sturdy, practical, yet fashionable outfit for traveling. The couple would then depart for their honeymoon, often under a shower of old shoes thrown by the guests for good luck. The honeymoon itself was a relatively new concept, an opportunity for the couple to have their first real, unchaperoned time together and, to be blunt, to consummate the marriage away from the prying eyes of their families. The entire event, from start to finish, was a piece of theater. It was a public performance of purity, piety, and property. It was less a celebration of a couple's love and more a confirmation of a social and financial contract, executed with maximum pomp and minimum personal expression. For the woman at the center of it all, it was the climax of her life's training, the moment she fulfilled her destiny and officially became a wife. So, our bride is now a wife. Her next great duty, her biological destiny according to Victorian thinking, looms large, producing children, specifically a male heir. Pregnancy and childbirth in the 19th century were a strange and terrifying mix of suffocating social ritual, bizarre medical superstition, and very real, life-threatening danger. The moment a woman suspected she was pregnant, a cloak of secrecy descended. Pregnancy was not something to be celebrated publicly. It was a delicate condition, a private, almost shameful state because it was undeniable proof of a physical, sexual relationship. For the first few months, a woman would simply try to hide her changing body with cleverly designed clothes, shawls, and corsets that were let out slightly. By the time she could no longer hide her condition, she would go into confinement. This meant she would withdraw completely from society. She would stop receiving visitors, stop going out, and essentially live in seclusion within her own home. This could last for 4 or 5 months. The official reason was to protect her delicate sensibilities from the shocks and stresses of the outside world. The real reason was to hide her unsightly, pregnant body from public view. It was a period of enforced idleness and isolation. The medical understanding of pregnancy was creative. Doctors had all sorts of theories. One popular belief was in maternal impressions. It was thought that a pregnant woman's thoughts and experiences could physically mark her unborn child. If she was frightened by a dog, the baby might be born with a dog-shaped birthmark. If she craved strawberries, the baby might have a strawberry mark. This put enormous pressure on the woman to maintain a placid, cheerful, and beautiful state of mind at all times, lest she permanently scar her child with a negative thought. As the birth approached, the household would transform into a birthing center. The chosen room would be prepared. All sources of fresh air would be blocked off, windows sealed, keyholes plugged, because of a widespread fear of miasmas, or bad air, which was thought to cause infection. So, the birthing room was typically hot, dark, and completely airless. The birth itself was a major turning point in medical history. For centuries, childbirth had been an exclusively female domain, attended by female relatives and a midwife. But during the 19th century, male doctors, accoucheurs, began to assert their dominance over the field. They claimed to be more scientific and skilled than the traditional midwives. This led to a major power struggle. A doctor's presence at a birth was a status symbol for the family, but it also introduced a new level of awkwardness and potential danger. The actual process of labor was meant to be borne with quiet fortitude. A woman screaming in pain was seen as animalistic and unladylike. She was supposed to suffer in silence, a martyr to her maternal duty. Pain relief was a hugely controversial topic. The discovery of chloroform as an anesthetic in the 1840s offered a potential end to the agony of childbirth. But many people, particularly the church, argued against it. They quoted the Bible, "In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children," insisting that the pain of childbirth was God's ordained punishment for Eve's sin. The debate raged for years, until 1853, when Queen Victoria herself requested and used chloroform for the birth of her 8th child, Prince Leopold. The Queen's endorsement made pain relief respectable, and it became much more common, at least for those who could afford it. But even with chloroform, childbirth was incredibly dangerous. Before the understanding of germ theory, doctors would go from attending an autopsy to delivering a baby without washing their hands. The result was a terrifyingly high rate of puerperal fever, or childbed fever, a bacterial infection of the uterus that was often a death sentence. For a Victorian woman, giving birth was a genuine brush with death. Every time a woman went into confinement, she and her family knew there was a real possibility she would not survive. The frilly lace and whispered congratulations of a Victorian christening were shadowed by the ever-present reality of the tombstone. Assuming our Victorian woman survives the ordeal of childbirth, she is now a mother. But what did that actually mean? The ideal of the Victorian mother was a strange contradiction. She was simultaneously placed on a pedestal as the moral heart of the family, the embodiment of selfless love, and at the same time, she was expected to be almost completely hands-off in the practical, day-to-day care of her own children. The first and most immediate decision a new upper-class mother had to make was about feeding. Breastfeeding was considered a bit common. It was animalistic, messy, and physically demanding. It was something working-class women did. For the lady of the house, it was much more fashionable, and convenient, to hire a wet nurse. A wet nurse was a working-class woman who had recently given birth herself and was hired to breastfeed the wealthy baby. This created a whole host of problems. There was a huge market for wet nurses, and often these were desperate young women, sometimes unmarried, who had to give up their own baby to a baby farm or a relative in order to take a live-in position nursing a stranger's child. The emotional toll of this must have been immense. For the hiring family, it was also a source of anxiety. There was a belief that a nurse's moral character could be transmitted through her breast milk. So, a family would go to great lengths to find a wet nurse who was placid, honest, and from good, sturdy country stock. The health and character of the wet nurse were scrutinized far more than her own child's needs. As the children grew, as we've discussed, they were raised in the nursery by the nanny and later the governess. The mother's role was more of a manager and a moral figurehead than a caregiver. She would receive her children at scheduled times of the day. They would be brought down to the drawing room, clean and beautifully dressed, for a brief, formal visit. The relationship was often one of respectful distance. The pressure to produce a male heir was immense. A woman standing in her husband's family, and in society, was hugely elevated by the birth of a son. A son would inherit the title, the property, the family name. A daughter, while loved, was another future expense, another dowry to be paid, another trousseau to be assembled. A woman who only produced daughters could be seen as a failure, a deep disappointment to her husband and his family. This turned her own body and her own children into a high-stakes gamble for status and security. She was also responsible for the moral and religious education of her children, particularly her daughters. It was her job to begin the long process of molding her daughter into a future angel in the house. She would teach her prayers, supervise her first sewing lessons, and correct her posture. She was the first drill sergeant in the boot camp of ladylike behavior. It's a strange and rather sad picture from our modern perspective. The very ideal of motherhood that the Victorians celebrated, the pure, selfless, ever-present angel, was one that required a woman to subcontract out almost all the actual, physical work of mothering. The hugs, the feeding, the comforting after a nightmare, these were often the duties of a paid employee. The mother was the CEO of the nursery, a distant, benevolent queen, not a hands-on parent. The emotional cost of this system, for both the mothers and the children, is something we can only imagine. When the family was not in London for the season, the annual whirlwind of balls, parties, and social events, their lives revolved around the country house. The country house was more than just a big house in the countryside. It was the symbolic heart of the family's power, the source of its wealth, from the tenants who farmed the land, and a self-contained social universe with its own unique set of rules. A major feature of country life was the weekend party. A family would invite a group of guests to arrive on a Friday and stay until Monday. For the hostess, this was a logistical challenge that would make a modern event planner break out in a cold sweat. She had to plan the guest list with strategic precision, inviting a mix of interesting people who would get along, but also ensuring the right number of eligible young men and women were present for matchmaking purposes. She then had to assign the bedrooms. This was another minefield of precedence. The most important guests got the best rooms with the nicest views. A less important guest might be tucked away in a smaller room at the back of the house. Insulting a guest with a poor room assignment was a major blunder. She also had to plan every moment of the guest's time. There would be a rigid schedule of meals, activities, and entertainment. A typical day might involve breakfast, after which the men would go off to hunt, shoot, or fish. And what did the women do while the men were out proving their masculinity? They were left to their own devices, but within a very structured framework. They might go for a gentle walk around the gardens, chaperoned, of course. They might gather in the drawing room to do needlepoint and gossip. They might play a sedate game of croquet or lawn tennis. Or they might sit in the library and write letters. The key was to look occupied and elegant, but never bored. The return of the men from the hunt in the late afternoon was a key moment. The women were expected to gather to greet them, to admire their haul of dead birds or fish, and to listen with rapt attention to the stories of their sporting prowess. Then came the elaborate ritual of changing for dinner. A guest would bring enough outfits for every occasion. To appear at dinner in the same dress you wore the day before was unthinkable. After the multi-course dinner, there would be entertainment in the drawing room. Someone might be persuaded to play the piano or sing. There might be card games, like whist. Or they might play elaborate parlor games and charades. These games were one of the few opportunities for a bit of sanctioned silliness and flirtation. For the guests, being a good guest was a skill in itself. You had to arrive on time and, more importantly, leave on time. To overstay your welcome was a terrible sin. You had to bring a small gift for your hostess. You had to compliment the house, the food, and the children. You had to participate enthusiastically in all the planned activities. And you had to remember to tip the servants at the end of your stay. The amount you tipped the butler, the housekeeper, and the groom who looked after your horse was a signal of your own status and breeding. The country house weekend was a microcosm of Victorian society. It was a place of intense social maneuvering, of flirtation and matchmaking, of gossip and rivalry, all played out against a backdrop of beautiful gardens and polite conversation. For the lady of the house, it was the ultimate test of her skills as a manager, a hostess, and a social strategist. Her success was measured by the smooth running of the event and the happy, comfortable hum of her guests. It was her grand opera, and she was its conductor. Now, one of the few acceptable ways for a respectable woman to have a public life and exert some influence outside her own home was through charity and philanthropy. The Victorian era, for all its progress and prosperity, was also a time of extreme poverty, disease, and social problems. The industrial cities were filled with slums, orphans, and desperate people. For the conscientious upper-class woman, this was a moral calling. Charity was seen as a natural extension of her female role as a nurturer and a moral guardian. The most common form of charity work was visiting the poor. A lady, often accompanied by a local clergyman or another woman, would go into the slums to visit poor families in their homes. The goal was twofold. First, to provide material aid, a basket of food, some coal for the fire, some old clothes. Second, and in their minds more importantly, to provide moral guidance. The charitable visitor was there to be a role model. She would inspect the home for cleanliness. She would inquire about whether the children were attending Sunday school. She would admonish the husband for spending his wages on alcohol. She was there to teach the poor how to be more like the middle classes, thrifty, clean, sober, and pious. You can imagine how this was received. There was, of course, a huge amount of condescension baked into the whole enterprise. The visiting lady, in her fine clothes and gloves, would sweep into a crowded, freezing tenement room, dispensing advice to a woman who was probably her own age but looked 20 years older from a lifetime of hardship. There was a genuine desire to help, but it was filtered through a thick lens of class prejudice and a firm belief that poverty was usually the result of a moral failing, not a systemic economic problem. Women were also the driving force behind the creation of countless charitable organizations. They founded orphanages, hospitals, soup kitchens, and rescue societies for fallen women. They organized fundraising bazaars, where they would sell their own handmade items to raise money for their chosen cause. These bazaars were major social events, a chance for women to show off their organizational skills and their social networks. One of the biggest social movements driven largely by women was the temperance movement, the campaign against alcohol. Alcoholism was a huge problem in Victorian Britain, particularly among the working classes. It was seen as the root of poverty, crime, and domestic violence. Women were at the forefront of the fight, framing it as a battle to protect the home and the family from the evils of drink. They organized massive rallies, sponsored temperance hotels that didn't serve alcohol, and produced a flood of propaganda about the dangers of demon drink. For a woman, charity work was a tightrope walk. It allowed her to engage with the major social issues of her day, to develop real organizational and leadership skills, and to have a purpose beyond her own drawing room. But she had to do it in a way that was seen as properly feminine. She was supposed to be motivated by compassion and piety, not by personal ambition or a desire for power. Her work was framed as an extension of her domestic duties, a kind of housekeeping for the entire nation. It was a small, sanctioned window into the public sphere, and many women used it to make a real and lasting impact on their society. By the mid to late 19th century, a new and exciting public space was opening up for women, the department store. The rise of grand, palace-like stores like Selfridges in London or Marshall Field's in Chicago was a complete game-changer for women's lives. Before department stores, shopping was a fragmented and often male-dominated affair. A woman would have to go to a specialist draper for fabric, a haberdasher for thread, a milliner for a hat. These were often small, dark shops, and haggling was common. The department store was different. It was a whole world under one roof. It was bright, it was beautiful, it was luxurious. It had huge plate glass windows, grand staircases, and later, elevators. It was a public space, but it was designed to be safe, respectable, and welcoming for women. It was one of the first places where a middle-class woman could go and spend time in public without a male escort. Shopping became a new and acceptable leisure activity. A woman could browse for hours, looking at the latest fashions from Paris, inspecting furniture, or choosing a new set of china. The stores had fixed prices, which removed the awkwardness of haggling. They offered services designed to make women feel comfortable and pampered, restaurants and tea rooms, ladies' restrooms, and reading rooms where they could rest their feet. The department store was a fantasy world. It sold not just goods, but an aspirational lifestyle. By buying a certain dress or a particular brand of perfume, a woman could feel like she was participating in the glamorous world she saw in the ladies' magazines. It was the birth of modern consumer culture, and women were its primary target. But this new freedom had a dark side. It created new anxieties. The pressure to keep up with the latest fashions was intense. It also created a new social problem, kleptomania. The overwhelming temptation of all this beautiful, accessible merchandise led to a rash of shoplifting, particularly among middle and upper-class women. Doctors of the time pathologized this, defining kleptomania as a nervous disorder specific to women, caused by the overstimulation and temptations of the modern department store. A poor woman who stole was a thief, a rich woman who stole was a patient, a victim of her own frail female nerves. And we can't forget the women on the other side of the counter, the shop girls. This was a new and growing profession for working-class women. It was considered more genteel than factory or domestic work. But it was incredibly grueling. Shop girls had to stand on their feet for 10 to 12 hours a day, often forbidden from sitting down. They were paid very little and had to adhere to a strict dress code and a code of conduct that demanded constant politeness and deference to the wealthy customers they served. They were a visible symbol of the vast class divide, the silent, exhausted enablers of the wealthy woman's new favorite pastime. The department store was a woman's paradise, but it was a paradise built, like so much of Victorian society, on the hard labor of other, less fortunate women. Let's return to the home, but this time, to a room that was a constant, looming presence in the Victorian imagination, the sick room. With disease so prevalent and medicine so primitive, serious illness was a frequent visitor in every household. And when illness struck, the home was transformed, and the woman of the house took on one of her most sacred roles, the nurse. Nursing the sick was seen as the ultimate expression of feminine virtue. It was a woman's duty to be a ministering angel, to bring comfort, order, and piety to the suffering. Before Florence Nightingale professionalized the field, nursing was almost entirely a domestic affair, and the mistress of the house was the head nurse. The sickroom itself was a highly ritualized space. It was to be kept spotlessly clean, quiet, and usually darkened. The woman in charge was expected to be calm, cheerful, and endlessly patient. She was to show no signs of fatigue or disgust, no matter how grim the illness. Her performance of serene competence was thought to be as important to the patient's recovery as any medicine. There was a whole etiquette to visiting the sick. You would never visit without being invited. You would speak in a hushed voice. Your visit would be brief. You were not to speak of gloomy or upsetting topics. Instead, you were to bring cheerful gossip, read a light-hearted poem, or perhaps a passage from the Bible. The goal was to distract the patient from their suffering. To weep or show distress in front of the patient was a terrible breach of etiquette. You were supposed to be a bringer of cheer, not a mirror of their misery. And then there was the ultimate performance, the good death. The Victorians were obsessed with the idea of dying well. A good death was one that happened at home, surrounded by loving family. The dying person was expected to be calm, lucid, and pious. They were supposed to use their final hours to give spiritual advice to their family, to forgive their enemies, and to express their faith in God and their readiness for the afterlife. It was the final, most important social occasion of a person's life, and it was the woman's job to stage manage it. She would gather the family, read from the Bible, and ensure the scene was one of peaceful, sorrowful piety. The moment of death itself was to be met with quiet tears and prayer, not with loud, uncontrolled wailing. This ideal of the beautiful death was portrayed endlessly in Victorian art and literature. It was a way of taming the terror of death, of wrapping it in a comforting blanket of religious sentiment and domestic ritual. Of course, the reality was often very different. Death from diseases like cholera or typhus was often agonizing, messy, and anything but beautiful. But the ideal was powerful. It placed a huge burden on women to not only care for the physical needs of the dying but also to orchestrate their final moments into a moving and morally uplifting tableau. It was the final, and most demanding, performance of her role as the angel in the house. Amidst all these grand, dramatic life events, there was a quieter, but equally important, daily ritual that was the absolute bedrock of female social life: afternoon tea. Tea itself had been popular in Britain for centuries, but the concept of afternoon tea as a separate meal and a distinct social event was a Victorian invention, often credited to Anna, the Duchess of Bedford, in the 1840s. She found herself getting hungry in the long gap between a light lunch and a very late dinner, so she started having a tray of tea, bread and butter, and cake brought to her room in the late afternoon. She soon started inviting her friends to join her, and a tradition was born. By the late Victorian era, afternoon tea was an institution. It was a predominantly female social ritual. While men were at their clubs or offices, women would gather in each other's drawing rooms between 4 and 5 p.m. It was a chance to catch up on gossip, to discuss fashion and family news, and to forge and maintain the female friendships that were so crucial in their constrained lives. The etiquette of the tea table was, naturally, incredibly precise. The hostess would sit at a small table, on which sat a silver tea service, a teapot, a hot water pot, a milk jug, a sugar bowl, and a slop basin, for the dregs of a cup before pouring a fresh one. She was expected to know exactly how her guests took their tea, how much milk, how many lumps of sugar. To have to ask was a sign of a forgetful hostess. The food served was light and delicate. There would be thin, crustless sandwiches, cut into small triangles or fingers, with fillings like cucumber or egg mayonnaise. There would be scones with jam and clotted cream, and the debate over whether to put the jam or the cream on first was as fierce then as it is now. And there would be a selection of small, beautiful cakes and pastries. You had to eat these things with a certain delicate grace. You never took a big bite of anything. You took your gloves off. You held your teacup with your pinky finger either down or gently curved, but never, ever sticking straight out. You stirred your tea with a gentle, back-and-forth motion, never clanking the spoon against the side of the cup. When you weren't drinking, your cup and saucer were to rest on your lap, or on a nearby table. The conversation was supposed to be as light and pleasant as the food. This was the prime time for exchanging social intelligence. Who was engaged? Who was having a baby? Who had committed some minor social blunder at a recent dinner party? The tea table was the headquarters of the female gossip network, a place where reputations could be quietly made or broken over a cup of Earl Grey. But for all its rigid rules, afternoon tea was also a sanctuary. The drawing room during tea time was a female space. It was a place where women could relax, connect, and speak with a freedom they couldn't in mixed company. It was a ritual that reinforced the bonds between mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends. In a world that so often separated and controlled them, the humble teacup became a symbol of their own distinct, and surprisingly powerful, social world.